Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Salman Anjum, once again here on my YouTube channel with a very exciting topic in biology. And today my business is to discuss about cells. So before explaining more biologically what cells are, I would explain why the word cell is given. Cell is just an English word which means a boundary, a space, a room, and such a room or a space in which certain things can be stored. So if I draw here, let's say, just very generally, a cell. So cell can be just drawn like this, like some small chamber, or cell can be drawn like this, or it can have, you can draw just any shape you like, as long as it is having some space inside. So why in biology we say that cells are present? Basically, the molecules that we were discussing last time, like carbohydrates or proteins or water or DNA or something like ATP or lipids, all of these molecules, they basically live inside these small rooms. For example, DNA lives in here, small ATPs, they live in here, carbohydrates, they live in here, and the proteins, lipids, everything, they are living inside this small boundary, which is called a cell. So of course, otherwise, if there is no cell, what will happen? These things, very important small molecules, they cannot be stored at one place. They require to be at one place to interact with each other or to perform some certain reactions. So cell is basically providing them a space as well as holding all of these small molecules at a closer distance so that they can communicate or interact with each other and chemical reactions are possible. So if we look in biology, now more specifically, why these cells which are holding these small molecules, they are called as the basic unit of life. It will not be wrong if I define this way, that the bodies of living things, let's say of human being, they are the polymers of cells. Exactly the same way we were defining monomers and polymers. Let's say it will not be wrong if I say that cells are monomers of our bodies. If you have too many cells, for example, and you keep on adding cells over each other, you ultimately get a whole organism. So that means these small cells, they are the monomers of our body. So our body is basically a polymer, and these cells, they behave like a monomer. So that we can take another example. Let's say you have a wall at home, just a general brick wall. So what you do, you take small bricks, you keep on adding small bricks over each other, and ultimately you get a big, very strong wall. And in the same way, if you keep on adding bricks over bricks, you ultimately get a beautiful home. So what brick is doing in that wall, brick is not only making that wall, plus brick is basically contributing to the strength of the wall. So that means these cells, they behave exactly like a brick in a wall. So cells are not only making our body, but also giving us the shape as well as the strength. So that is why the cells are called the basic unit of life. If I add further, since these small molecules, as I explained before, these small molecules, they are staying in the cells and certain chemical reactions are happening inside the cells. So that means cells are performing something. Cells are quite functional. So when there are too many cells and they all are doing something, they all are performing some function, so ultimately we can say your body is performing some function. So this way we can define the cells as the cells are the basic structural and functional unit of the organisms, or the basic unit of life. So if we quickly define then, that every living thing that you encounter around you, they are composed of cells. So I leave it to you to find out which living things you find around you. Of course, first of all, human beings, your brothers, sisters, everyone, people walking around you, they all are made of cells. Then if you look around, you will find different plants. They have beautiful leaves, flowers, shoots, roots, stem. Everything in the case of plant is again made by cells. Now if you look around, search for the animals, you see around beautiful cats, the dogs, or other birds which are flying. So their bodies are again made of cells. Or if you find fish swimming around in the deep sea, so that is again made by the cells. So everything that you can see with your naked eyes is made by very small cells. Or even the things that you cannot see with your naked eyes. For example, the microorganisms. You must have heard the word bacteria. They're also made by small cells. Of course, we'll define later who are the organisms who are unicellular and who are multicellular. But in general, any individual cell is too small to be seen. So we can call the cells are basically microscopic. This tells us something, that without the use of a microscope, which is a beautiful instrument, we were unable to witness or see or visualize the cells. That means, of course, cells are present on this planet since ages, but they were for the first time seen or discovered by the scientists after the discovery of the microscope, and that happened around mid 1600. So again, what they are doing, they are constituting the structure of organism. For example, our hands, arms, face, eyes, head, feet, everything is made of cells. And when we say our legs are walking, so actually collectively the cells of the legs, they are basically contributing for the function which we say walk. So this image basically is showing that cells, they are not that circular like the way, or they are not that simple the way I have drawn here. Basically, the cells, they are coming in different shapes. For example, they can be quite circular, they can be quite irregular, they can be quite regular. Plus, there are certain molecules which are attached on the outer surface, and they can be called as certain extensions present on the outer side of the cell. For example, here, if this is a cell, so these are the outer extensions, and they have a very, very important role. These extensions basically, they have a role in communication. For example, if there is one cell, so this cell wants to communicate a neighboring cell, so these extensions basically are a source of communication between these two cells, plus these extensions are also holding the two cells together. So cell, although it is too small, yet it is too complex to understand. As I said before, that cells were not seen until the discovery of the microscope. So there was a scientist whose name was Robert Hooke, and he discovered for the first time a cell when he was working to make his own microscope, and he observed the cork cells. As you can see on the right side, this panel, this is showing small chambers. So you can see small dots, small spaces, and they all are tiny cells. That means on this image there are quite a lot of cells present. After the discovery by Robert Hooke, there were many other scientists who got interested to learn about the cells. For example, there was a scientist, Anton Van, and he in 1673 was working on analyzing pond water. Pond water, just common pond water, and he observed that pond water under the microscope, and he observed and discovered that the pond water contains some microorganisms which were just moving around or floating inside that small drop of the pond water. Otherwise, when he was looking at the pond water through his eyes, he was unable to see any microorganisms unless until he put the drop of the pond water under the microscope, and he got very surprised that a small drop contained a lot of microorganisms, and he named them as protists. So there are certain examples of the protist. As you can see on the background, this is a pond water, and this pond water can contain many different types of protists. I would later explain what these protists are and how they are different from other kind of microorganisms. At this time, if we just take them as an example, that they are microorganisms and they are composed of, or they are made by cells. And there are written certain examples of protist type of microorganisms which are found in the pond water. So if we move on, then there was another scientist in 1838, and his name was Schleiden, and he was working on plants, and he performed the same experiment that he tried to observe the plant part, which is called plant tissue, a small part of the plant, under the microscope. And he also himself got very excited and surprised that he found small chambers in that plant tissue. And he said that the plant tissue is also composed of cells. Later in 1839, there was another scientist who was working on animals. His name was Schwann, and he was interested to study a small part or a small layer from animal under the microscope. When he observed the animal body, under the microscope, he found that animals, they are also composed of small cells. So that means, according to these scientists, the animals, they contain cells, the plants, they're made of cells, and small microorganisms, they're also made by small cells. And all of these things, they happened after the studies of Robert Hooke. So once the scientists, they found that animals, microorganisms, the plants, they all contain cells, so why not they thought that they should put up a theory, and they named it as a cell theory. When they were discovering that every single thing, every single living organism on earth, they are composed of cells, so they wrote down a cell theory. And initially, there were two postulates of the cell theory. If we read this way, the first one is that all organisms, whether plants, microorganisms, or animals, they are composed of one or more cells. So why they were saying one? Basically, this thing was coming from microorganisms who are composed of just one cell. While why they put here more cells? Because animals and plants, they're composed of more number of cells. So this first postulate was exactly representing what they had discovered before. So second postulate was cell is the basic unit of structure for all organisms. So again, every part of the organisms that these scientists were working with, for example, plants, every little part of the plant, whether shoot, whether root, whether leaves, exactly the same way in animals, any little part, feet, hands, or any body part, it was composed of cells. So they said, actually, cells are making the feet, the hands, the eyes, the leaves of the plants, everything. So they said cell is the basic unit of structure for all organisms. Or you can say cells are basically making the organisms. So then there were coming certain questions from different other scientists. They were wondering, how come new cells are coming? For example, if you look at a small baby, he's small in size, but when he grows up, let's say there is a baby plant. So when baby plant is growing up, it is increasing in its height. So there were scientists who were quite confused. They were thinking maybe this plant is increasing in its number of cells, and there were other scientists who were saying maybe the size of the cell is just increasing, not the number. So scientists, they performed experiments and they found that actually the size of the cell is not increasing, rather cells are dividing and increasing in their number. So this way, the small babies, they grow up. That means when they grow up, they have more number of cells. So these studies, they came in 1858 by a scientist, Rudolf Virchow, and he was working on how one cell produces new cell, or how one cell produces next new generation. So the area of his research was cell division. Cell division means when one cell divides and it becomes two cells, and then those two cells, they again divide to make total number of 4 cells. You can see this one here. Let's say this is one cell, and when this cell divides, it becomes 2 cells. Again, after some time, then this cell divides to become 2 new cells, and this cell divides to become 2 new cells. So this way they keep on dividing and producing more and more cells. So this is called cells division. So according to this scientist's discovery, it was that the new cells, they come from the division of the pre-existing cells. So after this discovery, they added the point this way, that all cells, they arise from pre-existing cells. So now the cell theory is composed of these three very important postulates. Okay, I would mention one thing here. What is a difference between a theory and a law? Law, of course, is something which never changes, and that is applicable to everything and is very universal. But this theory is still a theory, it is not a law. An exception to this rule are viruses. So viruses are microorganisms and they are not composed of cells. They are just small particles composed of nucleic acid, protein, or lipids. It's a mixture of nucleic acid, protein, and lipid, but they don't have any cell. They are too small and they can enter into different cells. So this way, it's an exception to this rule that everything is composed of cells. Here, everything means things, living things, except viruses. They all are composed of cells, whether bacteria, whether plants, or animals. So we end here. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask me. Thank you so much.